Welcome back to Petty Astrology. I'm your host, Kaycee Felton-Lui. We've got the Sun, Mercury, Saturn, and Neptune all in Pisces right now, and it certainly feels like it. Sometimes during the season where the Sun is in Pisces, things can feel really heavy or all-consuming. It's just easy to get lost in it. And that makes sense, especially in the Northern Hemisphere where it happens at a time where many of us are dealing with winter and the lack of sun and vitamin D. But this year it feels different. Of course, it's different every year with the unique astrology of that particular time, but with the ongoing genocide in Palestine approaching 6 months of escalation, the emotional quality of Pisces season is hitting very hard. It's important to know that the planets don't make anything happen, the same way a clock doesn't make it the time it is. Astrology reflects our human experience, so don't blame anything on Pisces season. But something that this Pisces energy has me reflecting on is faith. On February 26th, Aaron Bushnell, a 25-year-old man on a live stream, walked towards the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. He seems calm and speaks clearly. He says, "Hello, my name is Aaron Bushnell. I'm an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme form of protest, but compared to what the people of Palestine have been experiencing at the hands of their colonizers, it is not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." He then positions the camera, pours gasoline over his head, puts his uniform hat on, and lights himself on fire. He says, "Free Palestine." He repeats "Free Palestine" 4 times until he's overtaken by the flames and can no longer speak. Police approach this burning young man with guns drawn as others shout that they don't need guns, they need fire extinguishers. There is already an attempt to obscure this as the act of a mentally disturbed person, not an explicit act of protest by a person with a conscience. Someone who, as a person in the military, is a piece of U.S. government property, destroying himself in a refusal to play his part in the death machine. In December, another protester self-immolated outside the Israeli consulate in Atlanta, Georgia. You can't even find their name online, and I suspect that's not an accident. But Aaron made sure to live stream himself in the lead up to and during his protest, so it could not be easily obscured. They're still trying to obscure it, most media and government alike, and they're banking on us sitting back and continuing to let this all happen, to be distracted by our Super Bowls or our self-care shopping. According to the little I've been able to find out about Aaron, he was a principled person, with politics not unlike the other person we're talking about on the podcast today. He reportedly did outreach to unhoused people in San Antonio. He believed that a death toll of nearly 30,000 Palestinian men, women, and children was so devastating that the sacrifice of his own life paled in comparison. And regardless of how you personally feel about Aaron's choice of protest, he put the U.S. government in a very difficult position. They have not yet been able to wish it away like it appears they did with the protester in Atlanta. How can the U.S. government try to sell us on the idea that giving your life for a cause is foolish, when that's the core of what it means to be in the military? If you are disturbed by the genocide, by Aaron's protest, and the many others who have self-immolated in the past year alone, that's a good sign. It's a sign that you're still in touch with a part of your humanity that so many of us seem to have abandoned. Your humanity is something that you can find faith in, that you can cultivate, and act on like the beautiful living thing that it is. You don't have to do what Aaron did, nor am I encouraging you to. But Aaron had faith. He had faith that he could go through with such an intense and painful final act. He had faith that we would hear him, and maybe that we would understand that we are all a part of something larger. That his death might be a terrible wrench in the machine, and maybe that his faith might help you find enough faith to be one too. That you might honor that feeling within you that says things are terribly wrong and must change. That you might believe that your words, your actions, your protest, whatever it may be, cannot wait. Especially with so many Palestinian lives at stake. that a better world is possible and that you can imagine it into being. Today on the podcast, astrologer Jennifer Russell joins for a conversation about the astrology of fashion designer, business owner, and TikTok favorite Madeline Pendleton. Then I'll talk more about cultivating faith this Pisces season and give you a heads up about the energy of the week. We are back with one of our favorite returning guests here on Petty Astrology. We've got Professor Jen Russell in the house. How are you, Jen?
Happy to be back. Doing kind of sleepy this Pisces season.
It's been sleepy vibes for sure. How has everything been in your corner of the world? I know you've been teaching astrology like a boss. You're all lit up today. You just had a class.
Yeah, I've been having fun with my students. We're just getting finished going through all of the planets today, so we're really starting to get into it. Very exciting stuff. We build layer by layer.
Yeah, I was just talking to a client today. I had a reading earlier, and they are very interested in studying astrology. And they were like, I just don't know how, you start putting it all together. And I was like, that is the Natal Foundation's class, because there's so many different like pieces to astrology that it can feel kind of overwhelming to get all the little pieces down. And then there are teachers like you that are very good at guiding people through that process and then helping you put it all back together. Once you got your ABCs down, you can start making some really cool sentences. So
yeah, it's planets, signs, and houses are all very important. I know a lot of people just focus on the sign something is in, but everything else matters a lot when we actually look at interpretation of charts. So it's really starting from the bottom.
Yeah, when you get to the level that we're at, I don't think people realize how many factors that we're looking at when we're reading. And all of those little details are what makes, I think what separates a good astrologer from a great astrologer is being able to notice all the little details. And that just comes from practice. Once you get fluent, you build up that muscle. So I'm sure it's very fun to see students start putting that stuff together as you go through that process.
Yeah, just the understanding of themselves and the people around them as we get further into it. It's just so gratifying. And that's what I like astrology to be used for. Like, how can we understand each other better instead of making those judgments on if someone's like good or not? We just work differently, and that's okay.
It's so good for that. Well, we're here to talk today about somebody very exciting, especially in the TikTok world, Madeline Pendleton. And if you are not familiar, they are a pretty popular TikTok creator. I think they've got like 1.5 million followers at this point. Madeline is somebody that is about 4 years older than me and is a fashion designer and runs a fashion company that is very alternative style. Madeline Pendleton has like piercings and tattoos and dyed hair and just very visibly, looks like somebody that has kind of a punk aesthetic, I would say. So very recognizable on a visual level alone. And I first discovered Madeline Pendleton on TikTok as well. That was where they came to my attention. And I think that they were already pretty popular at the time. What I noticed about that is, as a fellow millennial, I was like, this is a millennial person, but it seems like a lot of Madeline's fan base is Gen Z, which I think is really interesting. Like, it's very big sibling vibes. Madeline has also lived a lot of life, as we're going to get into, and seemed to really use TikTok as a space to help educate people, often younger than Madeline, to, kind of navigate this capitalist hellhole that we live in a little bit better, which I always really respected because that's kind of what the premise of this book is in a lot of ways. It's like really practical, useful information. But, Jen, you're Gen Z. That's actually what your name is short for.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think is the Gen Z attraction to Madeline Pendleton?
I think it is that they are someone that has this life experience. And I think Gen Z has really seen millennials go through a lot of hardship And for me, she's about the same age as my sister. So I do kind of get those like sibling vibes of like getting life advice on like saving for retirement, on how to get an apartment, on how to get a job. And all of these things were maybe not necessarily things I needed to hear, but some of it was useful advice for people I know in my generation. It was kind of, I don't know, like the world changed so much from like when our parents were our age that it's nice to have someone that's just a little bit older, that's been through it in the world that has changed so much that there's the ways that our parents navigated it was so different than how we have to do it now. Like we have to work through all of these these systems and things that are really meant to keep us in our place in a sense. And I really appreciate Madeline's approach to that of being like, here is like realistic advice. And I also know that this sucks and I don't want things to be this way. And we're also working towards a better world. But while we're here, these are, what you got to do for now. So I find that very helpful, having like practical advice for the here and now, but also a vision for what better can be.
Absolutely. Another thing to know about Madeline is that their company is one that pays all employees, regardless of what their role is, the same wage. So it's a really interesting company in the sense that it's just not traditionally run. They've talked a lot about that on TikTok and also just like how they deal with housing and things like that. And being a few years older than the average person in Gen Z, I think, having somebody that's just slightly ahead of the curve is a really nice thing, even for me. Madeline was born August 17th, 1986 in Fresno, California. And the reason that I actually even have this birth chart is because Madeline posted their birth chart on TikTok at one point because people were asking. She's not really into astrology, she said, but I'm very grateful that they cared enough to share the chart because now we can actually talk about them. And Madeline is now an author, wrote a book called I Survived Capitalism and All I Got Was This Lousy T-Shirt. Everything I wish I never had to learn about money. That was what prompted us to talk about Madeline Pendleton, just having this kind of memoir, but it's also a book about money management in the system that we live in. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 book in a lot of ways, but we've said this before on the podcast and we'll say it again for sure. But whenever we talk about somebody on this podcast and you share some placements with that person, it's really important to know that two people can have the exact same chart and express the energy completely differently. In fact, they probably do. So if you have parts of your chart that are the same or similar to Madeline Pendleton, just know that doesn't mean that you are just like them. That is really important to know. Just some details about Madeline. They are non-binary, so probably will be switching pronouns. They use all pronouns. They are a Virgo rising, Leo sun, Leo Mercury, and then we've got a Libra Venus and a Capricorn Mars and Capricorn Moon. And I will say when I first interacted with Madeline's content, I could tell that she's Californian right off the bat because they've got this accent that is just so Californian, but the vibe, and you and I are both Californian. Do you identify as Californian?
Yeah, I am a Californian transplanted to the Midwest, so that's I feel like it's infected my accent a little bit. But Madeline sounds like so many people that I grew up around, like
yeah,
very Californian.
I think I was just immediately drawn to them because it's like I just see somebody that is just very obviously alternative and very obviously Californian. And if you're not from California, I don't know, maybe that was very obvious to you because I guess we have a sort of vibe that we give off. And I really relate to Madeline in a lot of ways. Like, I was somebody that grew up listening to a lot of punk music and hardcore music. And I know that that has been a big part of Madeline's upbringing and kind of ethos in general. But the Californian vibes, I just feel like are unmatched. There is just this chill, laid back thing that a lot of us have. I wish I could bottle it and sell it because I just, I love it so much. I mean, I relate to it a lot because I find that I myself am kind of the same way. Like, it's just vibey. It's just, I want the vibe to be good and I want to have a chill time. And it's like, hey man, what's the problem? You know, like it's not super confrontational. It is very like West Coast laid back. I really appreciate that about Madeline because I think that it played a role in her, you know, blowing up on TikTok in the way that she did because it is so approachable in a way, you know. And I think I really love that about them because there's a lack of pretentiousness there, you know. Even as somebody who is a business owner and, you know, has lived a certain amount of life, like I think sometimes people take that and, you know, they get like a big head about it and I just feel like Madeline Pendleton always has seemed very down to earth in a lot of ways. And I think that Virgo rising is a part of it. You know, it's a very practical energy. And I love that this book is super practical, right? It's like, yeah, it's a memoir. It's about who they are and how they came to be in the position that they're in. But at the same time, with that Virgo energy, it's also a useful tool. It's not enough to just like, you know, talk about ourselves, right? It's like, oh, it also has to be functional. So that is a very Virgo rising, I think, approach to something like this, you know, talking about yourself, but yeah, like what's the point,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. I liked how after every chapter talking about her life, it was like the lesson I learned about money, very practical. Here's the advice I would give to you. I was like, that even those little sections could just be their own book, but I think it's so much more powerful paired with the life story because you can really see how like it directly impacted what they had to learn to be able to function and like some pitfalls that maybe happened before that you can fall into or maybe just like know to avoid. So it did really feel like big sister talking to you like I did this so you don't have to. I really like that energy. And a lot of the advice that was in this book is stuff that they've talked about on their TikTok before. So now I really like that it's all in one place now and I can reference it again and recommend it to people.
Virgo energy, I think another thing that people often kind of overlook with Virgo energy is it's very caring. It's very attentive energy. And I think that that is very much the case with this book. You know, it's not just about like, oh, I want to be practical and useful, but it's like, I genuinely want to help people. And I think Madeline, you know, presents themselves to the world in a way that is, you know, very helpful. But, you know, we start the book talking about where Madeline is from. And Madeline is from Fresno, California. And for those of us who are not super familiar with all of the different dynamics here in California, let me put you on. Fresno is kind of considered by people that are not from Fresno. I don't know. I would say it's kind of like a pit is the way that other people in California tend to regard Fresno. What would you say?
Yeah, I grew up pretty close by to where Madeline did, so it was very funny reading this book and be like, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know that area. Yeah, Fresno does not have a good reputation, I would say, in the communities surrounding it. It's not like a place that people want to be.
It's generally considered like a place that you drive through on the way to somewhere else. It's very disrespected, I would say, in general. I have not personally been to Fresno, so I can't really comment on any of it either way. But I do know that people, you know, talk very badly about it. And Madeline even talks about they went to go get a tattoo that reflected them being from Fresno. And the tattoo artist was like, why? You know, that's how badly Fresno is regarded if you're in California. So I think that's important to know is, you know, Madeline comes from a place where people, you know, didn't take that area seriously. I mean, it's literally considered like, you know, a place where you go when you have nowhere else to go kind of a thing. And I loved that Madeline broke it down in terms of class because, you know, I think in the United States, class is something that we are kind of taught to not talk about. It's like considered sort of impolite to, you know, get into the financial differences between people, even though it's, you know, hugely a part of our lives. I don't think it's a good thing that we're discouraged from talking about it because I think that we miss a lot of details of why our society is kind of constructed the way that it is. Fresno is a place where there are a lot of people living in poverty, a lot of working class people. And Madeline goes into detail about how there was like a better side of Fresno, and then there was the more impoverished side of Fresno where she was from. She said she didn't even know that the family was struggling as much as they were because it was so normalized. It just was completely normal to be around people that, had to live with their grandparents because their family didn't have enough money to kind of live on their own, or rent was hard to come by, or, just dealing with the daily things that people who are struggling to make ends meet have to deal with. Like all of that was very normal for her. At one point, she talks about how her father, who was primary parent early on in their life, they were kind of homeless, essentially, like couch surfing and things like that. So it was a very difficult kind of early start. But the way that Madeline describes it is there's no sense of like feel bad for me about it, or, it's just very matter of fact. Like this is just how things were. And I would point to that Leo Mercury because I feel like there is a sense of pride with that Leo energy, instead of like shying away from the fact that, they're from Fresno and it's this place that people don't generally regard as a good place to be from. It was just, very, very matter of fact, very proud, very appreciative in certain ways of like the way that upbringing shaped the way that she operates. Madeline also talked about their parents being very into like the punk and hardcore music scene. And so very early on, just like the role of music and kind of shaping politics. I think that another thing that people don't necessarily realize maybe at this point in time is that rock and roll is very working class. And a lot of the best rock music, punk music, hardcore music has come from people that are, very distinctly working class. And if you're not a fan of that type of music, a lot of like, especially punk music is very political. And so, you can see, not only how Madeline's class, played into music taste, but how music taste, kind of supported survival of, being in this very low income working class situation. I really relate to that quite a lot because my situation growing up was not quite as dire as Madeline's, but I was definitely like lower middle class, working class family. So, there's a lot of echoes of stuff that I really related to in this book very much. And that was really one of them because for me, as a young person, like coming across punk music or punk influenced music, it was saying things that I wasn't hearing spoken in any other part of the culture, pushing back against oppressive systems, pushing back against things that are totally normalized and yet are so sinister. So I really feel like it's important to understand that as something that has played a role in Madeline's life. And I mean, you can just see like if you first lay eyes on Madeline Pendleton, like they look a certain way. You can tell that music has probably played a role in just how they've developed as a person. So I appreciated her explaining that the two things are connected.
Yeah, it feels like we've become really detached from that in like the age of the internet, like those music-based subcultures that had politics, that had, like community built around them. I don't know. I feel like we've lost that in a way. Like it's really important to a lot of people's lives.
And Madeline does talk about that, like being in different scenes that had sort of a connection to music in some way. And it does seem to be like very much a part of how they built community and built a sense of connection with other people and, going to parties and then crashing on people's houses. Yeah, that's fun if you're partying or whatever. But Madeline also talks about, how many different people, including themselves, who were, crashing on these party houses in these more like punk environments. It was not just about partying. It was also about like poverty, finding a couch to surf while you were dealing with housing insecurity was something that was very much a part of their early life. Music illuminating class and illuminating, social struggle is, I think, something that Madeline demonstrates very clearly in the book. Yeah, Madeline, at a certain point, as a young person, noticed that their father was really struggling financially to take care of the two of them. There was a point where they really had like no furniture and, they were eating cereal and things like that to get by. And at a certain point, she was like, well, I think I should probably go live with mom now because you're struggling financially. And so there was a shift in, households. And then she talks about how living with mom was a little bit more challenging for other reasons. It sounds like they just didn't get along as well. But I do see like in the chart, it's very, very clear that dad was like really influential in terms of just Madeline's thinking and approach to life. And I feel like just somebody that taught Madeline a lot. Looking at Madeline's fourth house, you could definitely see like it does indicate, some instability, some changes maybe in the household environment, perhaps some poverty, perhaps some conflict in the household. And so, it was definitely, I think, challenging in certain ways for Madeline to sort of reach adulthood. She talks also about being a really good student in a lot of ways, but, not necessarily having the opportunities to do anything with that, really. I think even they were asked to leave high school early. I guess they were problematic in some certain way, and they were like, you have enough credits, so it's time for you to graduate. And just like up and just randomly finished high school.
Yeah, I really liked how they pointed out the difference between one side of town, their schools getting like guidance counselors and college admissions, like people talking to them, while her school got military recruiters. And that is such a stark divide of like class that we get to see in schools. That was definitely the case at the high school I went to. We had military recruiters there like every week. And if you wanted to speak to like a college admissions counselor, you had to do that on your own because they didn't come and talk to us.
I think also because we have public education in this country. I almost said company, which is kind of a Freudian slip, but in this country, we do have public education. So I think a lot of people, if they're not really like paying attention to it, they might think, okay, well, everything is equitable then, right? Actually, schooling is funded through property taxes. So if you live in an impoverished community, you're going to have less revenue to fund the schools. See how it perpetuates the cycle of poverty, because schools that are located in poorer areas are going to have less funds to educate the people there. And it becomes this perpetuating cycle, which is something that Madeline talks about. There was a point later on in the book where Madeline realized, my grandparents were people that were also really struggling with money and in fact had a lot of debt, essentially. It was generational. So this is a person that started life, a few steps behind in terms of finances. And we just see the story of that kind of continuing through Madeline's adulthood. And through no fault of their own. And, we don't choose to be born, in a situation where we're, struggling. And yet so many people that are born into situations with poorer families, it becomes a very difficult thing to climb out of. So that is just all throughout this book. But Madeline is essentially, becoming an adult at 17 and becoming responsible for themselves and, having to navigate getting a job and then living in a place where that's not really possible to get a well-paying job. It became very difficult. She talks about moving to a few different places. She talks about like coming to LA from time to time, partying here. And this was like, now these days, people are calling it the indie sleaze era. But Madeline was actually, there going to places like there was this club here called Spaceland that used to be a really popular place to like go and dance. I've been there, so it was like cool to see like all these places where that we've kind of crossed over. I was probably not there at the exact same time because they're a few years older than me. There was all of these like very LA places that they used to frequent. Madeline seems like somebody that has a lot of people in their circle, like somebody that probably has like a million different, friends and acquaintances. And you can kind of see that through the book. Like they mention all their different friends. I would point at the 11th house, Mercury, Leo for that. I feel like they're really pretty well networked for somebody that isn't, from a family that can make a phone call and get somebody to hire you and give you a job. But I feel like they've had to make those connections themselves very much. But yeah, she talks about how she really didn't even know that they were like poor because it was so just normal. And, as she got older, she was like, oh, we are actually struggling and, meeting adulthood and actually having to be in charge of bringing in an income to support themselves was, I think, what made them realize like their social status.
Yeah, I really liked how they talked about people that have just such different ideas of what comfortable means and what doing okay means. Like for somebody that's lower class, like that means maybe to them, like they have enough money to cover rent and get food for the week. And for someone else, it means they have enough money to like go on vacation twice a year and have a new car, and that's comfortable. And it's just the degree of what we think that is really shaped by our upbringing about what we see around us. Yeah, just like the social interactions that we have. And if you did grow up in like a lower class neighborhood, your idea of what doing well is going to be very different than somebody that grew up probably in like a more, I don't know, affluent neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. Madeline kind of took a tour of like all of California and seems to have lived in so many different places, which I think is really cool because California is so big that I feel like there's just so many different regional differences here. And it feels like Madeline has kind of done the California tour. So I would consider them somebody that, knows quite a lot about California because just has lived in so many different places. So they ended up in Santa Cruz and said it was very difficult to get work there that was actually well paying because it's kind of a smaller, quieter, more, vacation-y place to go. And so that was a challenge finding adequate work there. And so we just see Madeline working, a lot of jobs where they're underpaid, and it was just very challenging seeming to just make ends meet, driving a car that's breaking down all the time, which is something that a lot of poor people have to deal with, is like you can't find a car that is, functional and doesn't need to go to the shop all the time. And it becomes very exhausting because being poor is very expensive. If you have to take your car to the shop all the time and you're shelling out money, it becomes like you're just hemorrhaging money in these emergency situations and trying to keep it together and do your best. I've watched a lot of people in California have to kind of live that life.
Especially since we just don't have public infrastructure or like public transport like most places in California. So you have to have a car to be able to go to the places that have jobs. But then you don't get paid enough at that job to maintain your car. So it's just this, like constant struggle of like, will I be able to make it to work to make rent? Yeah, we know that struggle.
And then eventually they ended up in San Francisco, and they made a really good point that I think if people haven't lived in cities before is important to know. They were like, San Francisco was a lot more expensive, but there was rent control in place there. And there was this really cool part where they were talking about how there was kind of an ethos in San Francisco, at least at that time, where, if somebody was living in a rent controlled apartment and they were moving for any reason, they would do their best to facilitate somebody else from the community moving in and basically taking over that rent control apartment so that they could maintain that affordability, which I thought was really cool and a really smart way of kind of gaming the system in the little ways that we can. But the benefits of living in a place with rent control was helpful to Madeline and to people that they were around. So they said that, because of the rent control and because of people being more helpful towards each other in San Francisco in general, that in some ways it was more affordable to live there because they were able to like make more money, but also they had to be very strategic in the ways that they, sustain themselves there. So there were definitely like pros and cons, it seems, to like living in a big city. Sometimes it actually can be cheaper and in the end to live somewhere that is technically more expensive.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, you can find more support in those areas. Like they might have better programs, or I think especially in San Francisco, she talked about how she didn't need her car. She could get rid of it because it was more expensive to have a car and to maintain it, and to find parking is just this headache. And they actually have some public transportation there. So it was possible to not have a car, and that's a huge expense.
Massive. Yeah, public transportation in San Francisco is definitely one of the better places that I've been in terms of public transit. People really like it there. And there's also a lot of public support for it. So like, it gets funded, and you can see why somebody that at that time was lower income was able to kind of make it work for them. And then at a certain point, they ended up moving to Los Angeles, which is where they live now. And they ended up starting their business. The book opens in a very sad way. We start the book with a story, a heartbreaking story about Madeline's boyfriend at the time, who died by suicide due to financial stress. He was running a fashion business at the time that was not doing very well. And she said that he essentially was making sure that people he was employing were paid well and well supported, and at the same time, maybe not paying himself well enough. And the business was struggling in certain ways. And he ended up dying by suicide in a really heartbreaking way. And so she starts the book like that. And, I think that the reason why she started it that way is because we talk about money, we talk about finances, and a lot of financial books out there are written by older white guys who are wealthy. And because of that, then we should listen to them. And I think if you're not in that position, if you are somebody that is poor or working class, you understand how life and death money is. And this is a really, literal instance of that, where somebody's struggling with finances. It was stressful enough to where somebody, even who was in love, seemingly very happy in a lot of ways, was not able to navigate that situation. It's really sad. And I think it just demonstrated how seriously, Madeline takes the advice that she's giving. And in some ways, I wonder if she doesn't feel that she's saving lives in a certain way by sharing the information that they have. It's interesting too, because just looking at the chart in general, like overall, I would say that Madeline has a very financial chart in a lot of ways. And they themselves say early on in the book that they've been told, like, they think about money more than anybody. People notice this quality in her. And it's true. I mean, she's got a first house Venus, even, the being identified with money in such a literal way. There's a lot more in the chart that's not just that. But in some ways, I feel that is really like a part of their path, to share these resources. Obviously, Madeline is very familiar with thinking about money and obviously does it very much themselves. So I just feel like it's just part of their purpose, in this life, is to resource people better and to share education essentially about it from their own personal experience. Like, I went through this and hopefully you don't have to, because I learned these things and I'm telling you what I learned. Yeah, I think that, writing this book is a really significant.
That it was so powerful, I think, to have that lived experience, because I related to so many things that they said in this book, of being like sacrificing yourself for people that they have money to support themselves, and you think that you're helping them and they actually don't need the help, and you need to help yourself before you're trying to help other people. And just like the difference that people can have in saying if they're doing okay, like what that means, of knowing that people can have such very different ideas of that. Of like the one instance of her going to a friend's house and realizing that this person that they had been like floating money for like groceries and rent had a multi-story like underground home with their parents, and they were comfortable when they didn't have to worry about money. And just being like, yeah, I've been in situations like that, of where I guess you're more aware of it when you don't have it, and you want to help people so much because you understand the struggle. And there's other people that they don't think about it because they have enough. They're comparing themselves to people that have way more than them. Other people can have very, very different ideas of what enough is.
With that situation, just understanding how unfair everything is. The boyfriend that was, enormously wealthy, but like didn't seem to recognize that or discuss it. The family being very wealthy, the relativity of it all, and like where it's such a focus for Madeline, it's not such a focus for other people that didn't have to think about those things as much. And I think that was something that we see Madeline learn over, the course of years of experience of actually like encountering people that have more wealth in these social situations, like coming across people that you just very, very different backgrounds.
I really liked the thing they said about how if you're unsure of how someone is able to live their life, how they're not working, how they're like able to sustain themselves, that the answer is usually rich parents. And found that to be pretty true.
There were also instances like when Madeline was living in Santa Cruz and trying to make ends meet because they were being so grossly underpaid. One of the things that they would do would be to go into very fancy retail stores and take a seam ripper and take the tags for these luxury items and take the tags and put them on, like cheap clothes and use that to sell the clothes. There's a few instances of stuff like this that either she did or other people around did, and it's criminal. You know, legally it is criminal activity to do things like that. But I think that, you know, with the stories told in the book, it just really solidifies that, like, a lot of crime happens because people can't make ends meet. People I don't think that, you know, are doing very well are typically not seam ripping luxury clothes so that they can make rent. I think that's a really important thing to recognize. Like, as we move forward, we live in an era where crime and punishment is really attractive to a lot of people because they hate perceiving a lack of safety in the world. But the fact of the matter is when people are well resourced, they tend to do less crime. So it's important. I think that this book does a really good job of demonstrating that. If you hate crime, don't let people be poor instead of paying police. I live in Los Angeles, which so does Madeline. Over half of our city budget goes to police. So imagine if we took that budget and we applied it to people that are living in the city and not being able to make ends meet. I think actually we would see a reduction in crime in a way that police throwing people in jail doesn't necessarily reduce crime. I haven't seen any.
Yeah, it's usually making the situation worse because you miss work and then you lose your job and then you have less resources, even less security.
Or you become a felon and then it's very hard to get a job or be trusted. And then, how do you make your ends meet then? Probably not above board. So it becomes this really bad cycle. A lot of this book, I think, is really reflective of cycles. We see Madeline get into pretty enormous amounts of debt. At a certain point, like, she was being so poorly paid that she kind of started a little side hustle and was doing fashion work. And meanwhile, had accumulated just an enormous amount of debt going to a fashion school in, I believe it was in San Francisco. Went to a school that lost accreditation because they were just doing things that were kind of shady. It was just not super above board. And very often, the type of students that end up going to these schools that do things like that ended up being lower income students. And so she racked up an enormous amount of student debt and then also just debt to survive over the years. You know, ended up starting this side business to hopefully bring more money in. And at a certain point, ended up with like tens of thousands of dollars in debt. So that is another thing, I think, through the course of this book, that just debt is just, it keeps coming up. And, you know, at a certain point, Madeline talks about like losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, you know, just so anxious and overtaken with this distress of owing so much money. At a certain point, she says something like that it would take them until their 90s to pay off the debt that they had at that point at the rate that they were going. And it wasn't because they weren't working hard. It was just they were not being paid enough. You know, this is somebody that has been working since they were a teenager and, you know, working really hard and putting in the work and, you know, going to school the way that we're, you know, quote unquote, supposed to go to school. I had the same kind of indoctrination. It was that I was told that I was always expected to go to college. And it was because I came from a working class family. And it was like, well, we want you to do better than we did. And the way to do that is by educating yourself. A lot of us are told that. And then a lot of us end up taking on these massive amounts of debt that can really put us behind in a lot of ways. So that was something that happened to Madeline. You know, they have Pluto in the second house. And I think sometimes people will see that. And because everybody's scared of Pluto because, you know, somebody told them to be, they're like, oh no, that's a curse or whatever it is, whatever they think it means. I would say, you know, for somebody that started out pretty poor in life and then by the end of this book, we know owns half of a duplex with their partner and is a business owner and makes about $70,000 a year in their business. That's not very much in Los Angeles. I think that is really impressive for somebody that started out in such poverty. And I think that Pluto really demonstrates that beautifully, that it has been a transformative experience for them to, you know, move through these financial struggles through over the years. And they have ended up in a place that is very much different from where they started. And I think that's another reason why Madeline wrote this book, because it's like, well, I know that what I've done is a really hard thing to do. Another thing is Madeline is enormously intelligent. She's never really talking about how enormously intelligent she is, but she mentions that they got really good grades in school and like almost got perfect on their SATs. And a lot of people that are intelligent and that are more working class, they don't necessarily have the opportunities that, you know, somebody that maybe is even less smart but has more connections. Intelligence is not just like the only ingredient in making somebody financially comfortable by any means. I do think it helped Madeline get to where she has gotten.
Yeah. We have this idea that America's a meritocracy, that people that are rich are smart. And that's just not the case. There's a lot of very smart working class people that have to put all of their brain power towards finding ways to survive. And they get very creative with it. Like, as you see, Madeline, like all sorts of ways to like make ends meet that I think somebody that wouldn't be in that position wouldn't even like have the wherewithal to think of that if they were in the same position. I really do like how that Pluto played out in the second house of it being there was struggle, there was, lack, but transforming that experience and taking that knowledge and like turning that around into security and finding what's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too that, on a collective level, I think it's really important for us to think about like all the really driven, smart kids who are just living in poverty. They just happen to be born into families that just are under-resourced for whatever reason. How much do we lose as a collective by not empowering those kids to learn, to grow, to become, adults that are thriving and contributing something to the collective, as, hopefully we all do, right? I don't think we take account of that loss on a social level nearly enough. If it was truly a meritocracy, if it was truly, a more equitable public education system, I think on a macro level, we would be doing a lot better socially. So Madeline, I think, is one of those people. I think she's just kind of a rare person that was able to push through all of these financial challenges, like really intense stuff, to get to where they are now. So I think it's really remarkable in that way. And then eventually, we see this business developing, and Tunnel Vision, which is Madeline's business, it's a fairly small business, number wise, but everybody that works for this company, they all split the profits evenly. So it's kind of novel in that sense. You just don't hear about a lot of businesses operating that way. And what surprised me reading the book was that this was not something that was necessarily planned out. It wasn't like Madeline has talked about their politics being, all throughout their life being very leftist leaning. And in that music scene, that punk scene, there's just tons of like anarchists and things like that running around. So I'm not surprised that with her upbringing and with her interests, like she is very progressively minded. But it was not the reason for doing the business the way that they've done it. There's a whole, section detailing all of the struggles of getting this business going. It was years and years of really it not being super lucrative for them, and there being a lot of struggle and debt involved. But it really seems like it started out as a way to bring in extra money just because she was just not getting paid enough, period. And so that's how it kind of grew. But she was influenced by actually the boyfriend that died by suicide in the way that he had run his business and, tried to pay people well, and was actually what, from all accounts, a pretty good boss as far as bosses go in that way. And so she tried to learn from what he had done, but also his mistakes as well. And so she talks about that. She also talks about when she lived with that boyfriend, that was not having to worry about bills or housing was like really financially liberating for her and allowed them to just pay down a lot of that debt and whatnot. But once he died, she was kind of back where she started in a lot of ways, and just like had nowhere to go and didn't really have like enough money to, facilitate the move. Kind of had to build that business up because that was the asset that she had, and had to put it all into this business. So we see, she finally like figures out that it's actually easier in certain ways in terms of the way that they do their accounting to pay everybody the same rate. Well, she said, I was working more, so I ended up making a little bit more, but everybody was at the same rate. That seems to be how the pay structure came about. It was actually kind of trial and error, which is important to know, I think, because as we move into this Pluto and Aquarius era, and we are going to be tasked with changing our approach to how we do things together. And I think that will include how we do our economics, how we get paid, how we pay each other, how we work together. I think it's really important to know that this was not an immediate success. This was not something that Madeline figured out, and then perfectly implemented. They do have a Cat Moon and a Cat Mars. So I do feel like they can be the boss. And she talks about like, I don't really like being the boss. I don't really like being in charge. What I can also see in her chart as well. It's like they do have leadership qualities, but I don't know that they necessarily like desire to be, the center of attention, but I think that they can handle that level of attention. It was just good to see that the business didn't start out perfect, and yet it still managed to become something remarkable, which I think is really important because we're going to have to be experimental. And I think that people that don't have that tenacity, that I think actually a lot of us from working class families, we can kind of have that kind of grit that we just needed to survive. I think that has really come in handy. They didn't, fold the business and quit when it didn't work immediately or when it was even really struggling. That regeneration, that coming back, even though it seems like it was the end. There has been all of these challenges with the business that Madeline has, and the people that have worked there have managed to surf and come out the other side in a better position. So, but on that note, just talking about how important it is, even when we're struggling, to have hope. There was this really great quote that I pulled from the book. And I think this is just such a beautiful demonstration of that 11th house Leo Mercury. She said, "Nothing is permanent. You might find yourself in the worst financial situation of your life only to bounce back a few years later. Just try to ride it out. That's how life goes. And your ability to imagine a future that's better than now will be the most important skill that you have. It's a form of revolutionary optimism. And you need that, not only for your own mental health, but if you want to work towards a better future for everyone." So that optimism, that hopefulness, that is just a beautiful expression of that Mercury, because I do really think that saved her in a lot of ways and honestly allowed them to keep going, even though that there are moments in the story where things are so financially dire that I can understand how difficult it might have been to keep going, to keep pushing back and not just lay down and be defeated about it, which is something that, that happens as Madeline starts the book with, So this is a person that just knows how high the stakes are and yet has still managed to enjoy their life and actually, really thrive, I think, in a lot of ways. So I really love that quote.
Okay. It's so easy to get bogged down and upset with the way that things are now, and we're seeing all of these big corporations laying people off and having no regard for the people that have put time in, and there's just no, I think a lot of older generations had this idea that if you gave to a business that they would give back to you. There's this sense of loyalty, and that got completely lost. And that is not the case anymore. And we have to move forward. And if you want to be in a place that is a more caring environment at work, then maybe you need to make that yourself or work with people that also have that, because these big corporations that are traded on the stock market usually aren't very interested in the lives of their employees being good. It's just about the bottom line. Yeah, that's I think something that we're going to be needing to move past here as Pluto moves into Aquarius. More collective action and having hope that things can be different. And I think Madeline really provides that with showing her business and how they work, and it's probably not going to work for everybody that has a business, but it's a way to do it.
I also really love how they recognize that the system is fundamentally unjust, and we're basically faced with a lot of undesirable options of how we want to move forward. And they've said, this is not, I've not done everything perfectly. It's not a perfect model. It's not that I figured everything out, but I have used what I know and who I work with to come to the best place that we've been able to come. And so, everybody at their company makes $70,000-ish a year. And, when they have extra money, they've talked about how they all went and, bought new cars or new to them cars. They do things like that with their income. And I think that, thinking about if you were working at a company where if the company does really well, everybody takes home more money. I think that's really incentivizing for workers too, to actually care about how the business does instead of just clocking in and clocking out and collecting a paycheck, which I think is totally fine too in most circumstances. But I don't think we think enough about how working more cooperatively actually can make a business better.
Mm-hmm. And you see that, we've seen that the past few years of these companies having record profits and laying people off or just pay stagnating while everything gets more expensive. There's something very broken about that, about the effort that workers are putting in being just siphoned off to go to these people that just put money up. They didn't do anything to earn that.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to that first house Libra Venus, right? Like fairness, equity, justice. Those are all things that are really, that's how Madeline identifies themselves, as somebody that in their bones probably, needs things to be fair, needs things to be equitable, needs things to be progressive in some way. Otherwise, it's not going to feel very secure. And so I can completely see why this on an individual level works really well for Madeline as well, because that forward movement, that pushing the boundaries on things is something that is very important to the core of who they are. So I really enjoyed this book in a lot of ways. I really would recommend it to people that are, in a more financially tenuous situation, because there are a lot of really practical tips. But also, I think it's just like a good book to remind us that the things that we go through and the struggles that we have, especially, more financial struggles, they can change. They can change over time, and we can navigate the system the best we can. And some of the best ways to navigate the system are through, connecting with other people, relying on other people, and helping them when we can help them in exchange. So I feel like it's just like a really good example of like a very realistic approach to surviving the system we are in.
Yeah, I think this is the financial book I'd recommend to people, because a lot of the other ones, are written by people that already are resourced. And I think this is a really good human example of like what life looks like when you start out under resourced, and how you have to change your mindset into growth and like getting your needs met, really, and to like put your oxygen mask on and help other people when you can. But I think it's beautiful, and like all of that good information that she shares on TikTok now being in like a centralized place.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really cool.
I love a cat moon moment.
Right? I was really excited when I found out that they've got a cat moon. I also have a cat moon. And it makes just a lot of sense to me, because with that cat moon energy, it's
like you're going to figure it out.
There's some grit to it. It's like, regardless of how crappy I feel, like I'm going to get up and I'm going to keep moving forward. And I think that Capricorn Mars as well, it's just like they are somebody that is thinking long term. We, talk a lot about saving for retirement and their own reflections on, their aging grandparents not having enough money, and how that has really motivated them to make sure that they take care of themselves. Even when they're broke, they've been putting money towards retirement and, just thinking long term. Cap energy is really useful for that and for keeping it moving.
Yeah, that Cap Mars was like screaming. I could hear it when she was talking about like all of the crappy jobs that she would work, and how she'd be like going to school full time while working full time, and like been there. Like a Cat Mars too, like that like it is useful for just like getting through, like you're just gonna grind. I think the lesson you need to learn if you have Cap energy is to also learn when to take a rest, learn when to let things in rather than having to struggle. And I think this whole book was really that lesson that she's learned over their whole life, of being like, you are hardworking and industrious, and you need that to a certain extent, but also knowing how to set the systems up in your life so that you have some comfort and some ease, and you don't have to constantly be worrying about if you have enough, because you have like the auto pay system they've got set up, and like everything's separate. So much nicer than having to like scramble every month to be like, oh no, I spent that money that was meant for rent.
Absolutely.
That's pretty much it. Love Madeline.
Yeah. Shout out to all the alt people out there, the alternative punks that are out there trying to make the world better. Here's one of our greatest soldiers to date. I really appreciated the book for that. And, alt people know shit too.
Oh yeah. They got real world experience.
The energy has been thick lately with all of this Pisces energy. It can feel like very sink or swim energy, and you might find yourself getting stuck swimming in some places that are uncomfortable. On the day that this podcast comes out, we have the Sun and Mercury hanging out by Saturn, so if you're feeling restricted or stuck, I think we'll get a little relief from the heaviness as we move through the next few days and they start to separate. With Pisces energy, it is really easy to dip into a sense of fear, or if we're feeling down, to let it consume us. My mentor, Lori Rivers, who is also a producer of this podcast, does mundane predictions, which is a type of astrology that looks at world events. And she's talked about how March is going to be an intense month in the world. What's important to remember is that even if there are things happening in the world, that doesn't mean that each of us is doomed to suffer or be afraid or have a bad day. You can do that if you want to, but I want to encourage you, especially this week, to practice appreciation for everything that is even mildly enjoyable. If you had a really great sandwich, take the time to make note of that. Celebrate that. It's very easy to look at everything wrong in the world and translate that to our personal lives. Sometimes we can even feel selfish not doing that. But just because things are going on around us, even if they make us emotional, doesn't mean we need to take on the emotional weight of all of it. It's not even possible for us to do so, and it doesn't help anyone. I've been encouraging people who are sensitive, who are growing through it right now, to lean into those moments of deep emotion in the sense that they can remind us how deeply connected we are to each other and to all that is. We can't lose that part of ourselves or bury it, especially right now when the stakes are so high. I talked about Aaron Bushnell on TikTok, and unsurprisingly, I think that video was suppressed. Censorship and attempts to obscure the truth are alive and well. And we should pay attention to that. We need to pay attention to that as we move forward. But we don't have to get lost in the narratives. We can lean into what our heart and soul knows is right and true. That the abuses in the world are very real and are worth actively opposing. Because if we don't, I think that's a sign that we've let our connection go. If you're feeling emotional, I would encourage you to channel those feelings into creativity this week. It can be protest art, writing out how you feel, dancing around your living room, making things. And you don't need to make them for anyone else but you. It's enough to just do things because it's a human thing and because it feels good to do. Lean into your spirituality, your sense of connection with yourself, the deepest and most sensitive parts of you. Those are part of your humanity. And lean into your connection with the world around you. We are not meant to take on every issue alone. In fact, we still have Venus, Mars, and Pluto in Aquarius. So in order to respond to the times that we're living in, to honor that deep sensitivity and that connection, that if you're listening to me is probably very present, we need to do things differently than we've done them before. We need to join with others who understand this connection. And maybe they have a different way of explaining that connection, but just knowing that it's there. That just because something happens to someone else, that it doesn't mean we shouldn't be affected by it. Finding our allies instead of wasting our energy trying to convert people to our side. I think at this point, the sides are pretty clear. I hope more people change their minds, but at this point, I think we really need to channel our energy into moving us forward. Not lagging behind, trying to drag others along with us. The energy this week may feel a bit magnified. There are already protests planned for this coming weekend, so be sure if you're going to use all of your safety protocols. Masks help prevent COVID, measles, RSV, and more, but they're also a great tool to fight against surveillance. It's easy to lose our sense of hope and faith when things feel heavy, but understand that the idea that we are alone in this feeling is an illusion. No matter what our brains might be telling us, we are not alone. We are never doomed to face reality all on our own. And as I've been saying so much this year, when we come together, when we channel those feelings into action that aligns with who we are on a core level and what we want the future to look like, that's where we can find hope. That's where we can be inspired to continue, to keep going, especially on behalf of those who can't. People always talk about how sensitive and receptive Pisces energy can be, but Pisces energy can also be about putting a vibe out, changing the vibe. We don't have to sit here and just take it all. We can imagine and create something better, especially when we do it together. We are going to need to. This week especially, create and strengthen your connections. Look for the hope. Find ways to hold on to it. We have the new moon in Pisces coming up on March 10th. If you're looking to dive deeper into what that energy will be like and how you can make use of it in practical ways, my new moon manifesting circle will be meeting on Sunday, March 10th. I take you through the energy because every new moon has its own particular flavor and way to use it. And you don't have to know anything about astrology. I'm there to make it all clear and useful. And we have a really supportive community there. If you'd like to join us, you can head over to Patreon. The link is in the show notes. Take care of yourself this week and take care of each other. I'll see you next time. This episode was produced by Lori Rivers and brought to you by my sponsors over on Patreon.